Okay, so we're going to pick back up where we left off in class today, talking about Anglo-American cooperation. Anglo, of course, meaning the British, and American cooperation. So for a while now, the United States has been helping the British. They started with the Baseford destroyers deal, and then they went to Lend-Lease. Now we're going to start getting actually into where there's much more of a concrete connection between the two nations. So on August 9th, the Atlantic Conference took place. That was where Churchill and Roosevelt secretly traveled to the coast of Newfoundland. So Churchill boarded our naval destroyer, British naval destroyer, and came across. Roosevelt sailed up the Atlantic seacoast and met them there. Churchill boarded the American vessel, and upon meeting, Churchill said, "At long last, Mr. President," and Roosevelt replied, "Glad to have you aboard, Mr. Churchill." So their personal relationship began here. Now it never recommenced here because I think they had contact prior to when Roosevelt had been in doing some business in London before. But now they're beginning as a relationship of head of government to each other. And the purpose of their meeting was to discuss their common problems, including the Japanese menace. So Japan starts to come on the radar here because by August we're starting to see signs, as we're going to get by the end of this Ed puzzle, that the Japanese are going to be starting to make moves in the Pacific, and Roosevelt wants to start getting help from the British and helping with the British because the British also will have interest in the Pacific as well. At the end of the conference, Roosevelt and Churchill issued something called the Atlantic Charter. So the Atlantic Charter is one of these key documents that kind of shapes the rest of the war efforts. And while it's initially jointly signed by Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin will eventually include the Soviet Union in the Atlantic Charter as well. Now, when we look at some of these things with the Atlantic Charter, it's hard to believe that the Soviet Union would have agreed to it, but that was how that kind of went. So let's talk about the purpose of the charter was to outline democracy's hopes for a better world at the war's end. So they're looking ahead again. What will the world be like following the conclusion of the Second World War? And what they're arguing for is the rights of individuals, not necessarily of nations. So going back, those four freedoms that Theodore Roosevelt had spoken about earlier, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom from want, freedom from fear. Those are individual rights. Those are not national rights. So this incorporation of these profoundly individual human rights becomes kind of a keystone for the Atlantic Charter as well as for the post-war world order. And again, it brings in the whole idea of universal human rights. One of the documents that's released very early in the days of the United Nations in 1948 is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And these ideas really are created during the Second World War. The overall piece was we're going to avoid imperialistic annexations, so there will not be any territorial changes without hearing the wishes of the peoples, which means self-determination. So again, thinking back to World War I, Wilson's idea of self-determination, that countries will be able to kind of align themselves by their common ethnic groups or religious groups or racial groups, that idea of self-determination is resurrected with the Atlantic Charter. Now, again, we're going to see how this plays out post-World War II with Southeast Asia. But for now, again, Roosevelt and Churchill are going to have this statement that there's not going to be any imperialistic goals. The Charter also affirms the right of people to choose their own governments. And again, that's going to become key when we look at the wartime conferences, like the conferences at Tehran, the conferences at Casablanca, the conferences at Potsdam, the conferences at Yalta. All these conferences, they're trying to deal with how to put the world back together following the Second World War. One of the pieces is people have the right to choose their governments. Now, the British and the Americans obviously have one viewpoint of that, and the Soviets have a very different viewpoint of how it's going to go. But overall, there's this commitment to having people choose their own governments. And again, removing those governments that have been taken over by the dictator, so particularly in France, in Austria, in Poland, and other occupied territories around the world. The Atlantic Charter also espoused lowering trade barriers, again, because wars lead to shooting wars, and so by lowering trade barriers, by opening up free trade agreements, we'll reduce the tensions that occur around the world. Again, echoing that for freedom speech, with the world being free of want and free of fear. Another thing that the British surprisingly agreed to is this idea of freedom of the seas. At this time, Britain has the largest navy in the world, and Britain, as it says, Britannia rules the seas. So Britain is willing to commit itself to having open lines of transport, open lines of trade, open lines of movement of naval vessels around the oceans to have that freedom of the seas. And overall, a disarmament of the aggressors and a general disarmament after the war. So following the war, we're going to again remove the arms from the nations that went to war and reducing the armaments overall before we progress. And what you see on the right-hand side of the screen there is Churchill's edited copy of the final draft of the charter. So Churchill made some edits before it was the draft, and then it went into the final publications before it was released to the world. So let's talk about how the charter was viewed once it's released to the general public. So liberals, of course, were excited by this and were elated by the Atlantic Charter because there were so many echoes of Wilson's 14 points in it. So remember that Wilson's 14 points had come out in 1917. This is a mere 24 years later. So there's many people who are in the halls of power who worked with Roosevelt, who would have been, with Wilson, who would have been rising up through government ranks at the time, who are now in those areas of power, and they see that. And there's a lot of people across the country that are very happy to see that Wilson's 14 points are coming back again. Those people who had been oppressed, those people who had been conquered during the war, were emboldened by the statements because, again, they're seeing that idea of self-representation. They're seeing their right of self-government. They're seeing their right that they will be able to be liberated from the oppressors and freed from tyranny in the future. Isolationists in the United States, though, were very hostile towards it. They were not pleased with it because why are we discussing our common policies with the British? So do we have to have anything with the British? The British are at war. Why are we making agreements with them? We should not be doing that. And by doing so, are we tying ourselves to the British and their war efforts? And largely then, the isolationist arguments, though, is missing the fact that the United States really wasn't neutral, that the United States, through its actions, had really kind of put itself into the position of supporting the Allies and not being neutral in the cause, just not being openly participatory in the war yet. And this political cartoon here, we see, Churchill is, this is John Bull. This isn't Churchill, but this is John Bull, a symbolism of the British, and Uncle Sam here. I'm not exactly sure if there's a representation of Russia, if that's just an image of Joe Stalin, but you see, John Bull representing the Brits, and Uncle Sam representing the United States. They're in bed together, and the bed's titled Down with Hitler, and crashing through the ceiling is Russia. So Stalin is crashing into the party, joining the democracies of the United States and Britain in fighting the Second World War. So what comes now? So obviously we've got the Lend-Lease shipments that are going to Britain, and Britain doesn't have enough destroyers to protect their ships. So Britain has to transport the goods. That's still part of the Lend-Lease agreements because, again, the Neutrality Act of 39 is still in play where we are not allowed to transport any goods on American ships. So Britain has to send the ships over to the United States. We have to load the ships. We load their ships. They ship it back, but there's not enough destroyers to protect their ships. So what happened in World War I, what is going to be what's happening in World War II, is that the British freighters would need to be escorted by U.S. warships. So American naval warships would then take the place of the British warships in making sure they left U.S. ports safely and arrived to British ports. So in July of 1941, Roosevelt made his decision to allow convoys to take place, where again American destroyers, American warships would, be at the front and the back and kind of through the convoys of the British freighters coming and get it. He ordered the convoys to get to the ships as far as Iceland, where the British would then take over from there. So I believe Iceland's about 2/3 of the way to the Brits at that point in time. So we would protect the ships all the way up to Iceland, and then from that point, the British would have to get them from Iceland down to the home islands. Needless to say, all this is going to lead to tension. And this tension blows up on September 4th when the USS Greer is fired upon by a German submarine in the waters of the Atlantic. Neither vessel, neither the submarine nor the USS Greer were damaged, but now we're going to start having tensions because once you start having our naval vessels fired upon by an enemy force, you are going to ratchet up the pressure. And so Roosevelt then orders a shoot-on-sight policy. So when American warships see the German submarines, they are ordered then to take the submarines out. And then just about a month and a half later, on October 17th, the USS Keary engages in a battle with submarines, and 11 men overall are lost aboard the ship, while the ship was crippled, but the ship was not sunk. So again, now we start to see this escalation. We had the neither vessel damaged. Now we see the ship being crippled in the ocean and men dying, and it just keeps going higher and higher and higher. Escalating 2 weeks later to where the the destroyer USS Reuben James was torpedoed off the coast of Iceland. And in the case of that, the ship sunk with a loss of 115 officers and enlisted men out of a crew of 160. All of the officers went down with the vessel. So none of the officers survived. The 45 that survived were the enlisted men. Every officer went down with the ship. At this point in time, with neutrality basically being just kind of on paper, it wasn't really being observed. And so then Congress on November 17th of 1941 repealed most of the terms of the Neutrality Acts, and Americans braced themselves for further attacks from Hitler's subs because they knew they were coming. Okay, so we're going to pause with the German side of things. We're going to jump over to the other coast. We're going to go to the West Coast and talk about our relationships with the Japanese. So the Japanese, just like the British, are islands, and they are not a very resource-rich island chain. They don't have much on their home islands, especially things like iron, oil, aviation fluid, steel. They very much need our production, our goods to be shipped to them and sold to them in order to function as a society, a modern industrial society. Assisting Japanese in any way was unpopular in America. There's a variety of reasons for that. Most of them are racially biased, but there's suspicions of the Japanese interest in the Pacific, and there's just this distrust overall of people from Asia, and therefore loaning any kind of help or giving, not even loaning help or giving any help because there's no need to help them, but giving goods to the Japanese was unpopular overall. And by late 1940, the government in D.C. imposes the first of its embargo of goods going to Japan. So we start to restrict what can be sold to the Japanese government. That continues in mid-1941 when the United States froze Japan's assets in America. So whatever the Japanese government controlled or whatever assets they had in our American banking system and our trading systems, we froze them so they could not access them or use them for any kind of wealth management on their part. We also stopped any shipments of fuel and other potential war materials. So at this point, now Japan's going to start to feel a squeeze, particularly in oil reserves. They have a large navy because they are an island, and if they want to do empire building, they're going to need their navy, which means they need oil. And Japan's going to start to feel the squeeze of these embargoes taking place on their country. So if you're a leader in Japan, you have one of two choices to make. Your first choice is to give in to America and cease some of your vocal aggressive language and some of your moves, or the other option is to break out of the embargo by taking the oil supplies and other riches of Southeast Asia, by seizing the territory where you can gain these things on your own. We obviously know which way they're going to go, and that they're going to go with choice number one, they didn't came to America with going to choice number two because they're going to go after the oil supplies in just a few short months. We're trying to negotiate a peace deal with the Japanese in November and December of 1941. They have their officials in Washington negotiating with our officials, and we're trying to reach some kind of a common agreement with them. Our basis was that Japan would have to evacuate China, which they had invaded with Manchuria, and remove their forces. And if they did so, we would renew our trade. Not open full trade with Japan, but renewed and limited trade. The Japanese imperialists, very much surrounding Emperor Hirohito, did not want to lose face. They had been conditioning the Japanese public that this was going to be Japan's moment in the sun, the empire of the rising sun. They were going to take their share. They were going to take their place among the great powers of the world. So if they looked like they were backtracking against the United States by removing their forces from China and by caving in, that would be a very shameful move on their part. And in Japanese society in the 1940s, it's all about face. It's all about having pride. And to do anything that you're kind of disgracing yourself, which made them hesitant to do anything. So again, faced with the idea of giving in to the Americans or going after other nations, they went after the option of choosing conquest. At this point in time, our armed forces had been able to crack the Japanese code messages, and we knew that war was the decision. We just did not know where the war was going to come because no one knew anything about Pearl Harbor. No one believed that Japan was going to be A, strong enough, they didn't believe they had the reach yet, or B, foolish enough to attack Hawaii. That was just something that the military command structure in DC could not envision, that they would be able to reach that far across the Pacific and to do a direct attack against what was our major naval base in Hawaii. So the Japanese played the game well, and they continued to negotiate all the way up to Pearl Harbor to mislead the United States and think that we're going to be able to negotiate and get out of this. But as we know, when we pick up tomorrow, that doesn't, and World War II begins for the United States. All right, so we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up in class tomorrow with the beginning of World War II for the U.S. with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Have a good rest of your day.